Hi, friends. Can we take a moment to talk about the sensitive topic of penetration? Matt Easton's favorite word. I neglected to show the penetration testing for the VA Irish arming sword the last time we reviewed it, but we did do that, so let's go ahead and show the footage.
Jim Finnegan lived in Walking Street, a gentleman Irishman, mighty odd. He seen a brogue so soft and sweet, and the rise in the world he carried the hod. Jim had a sort of a tippling way, with the love of the liquor now he was born. Help him on with his work each day, and the drum of the creature every morn.
So this arming sword has a kind of unusual tip. It, again, I described it as a Oakshott Type 12 blade. I'm not sure that that is actually correct. Most Type 12 or Type 13 blades are a little bit wider than this, but it comes down to a reasonably narrow point. It's not quite spatulate at the end. And then it's got a little bit of a tip right here. We had seen in some of my previous testing videos looking at the LK Chen swords that the Ming Dynasty swords have a rather rounded off point at the end. And we had just looked at the Albion Clontarf, which again has a very broad point and then a basically no point at the tip on the end at all. This outperforms both of those type of swords, and in fact, the stats on it with a naked drop of 4.6 centimeters and then a normalized drop of 7 centimeters very much match the drops put up by the Hanwei Viking sword, even though they have very different profiles. This sword is not as thick in cross section. This sword is narrower in profile than the Viking sword, even though the Viking sword tapers to a kind of more acute point when we get to the final tip than it. They have similar blade flexibilities. They're both just about 20 kilograms of flex in the blade. This one tends to wobble, I think, a little bit more on the whole than the Hanwei Viking sword. And they're around the same weight. This one, I think, is maybe 50 or 100 grams lighter than the Hanwei Viking sword. But I found that rather interesting that even though they're pretty different swords, this one performed more similar in the penetration testing than the Albion sword did, even though the Albion sword superficially looks a lot closer than the Hanwei to the Hanwei Viking sword than this arming sword from Valiant Armoury. So on the whole, I think that this is impressive. Again, it's a very good cutting sword, and it has a decent penetration. And as a quick reminder for the methodology that's being done here, this isn't trying to simulate anything. This is just a standardized testing so I can compare all of the different swords because it's repeatable. I take the swords and I drop them 2 times. I lift them approximately 35 centimeters up in the air. I drop the swords under their own power into my my archery foam target. And then after I have about 10 or 15 trials and get a consistent measurement for that, I do the same thing again, this time adding weight to the hilt behind them. I raise the total weight of the sword and weights to 2,500 grams so that all of the swords are falling with the same amount of mass. Gravity is pulling down with the same amount of force on them. That's a normalized force to see how much penetration the swords will get with a fair amount of force being driven into them. So that's the number that I'm mostly interested in. The first number where we just see what the swords are being dropped on it's a number for curiosity, but that second kind of bigger number is kind of the level playing field that all of the swords are being compared to. So even though I've been putting those numbers up on the screen, and by this point we have a bunch of swords, why don't we make it even easier? Let's compare all the swords using the time-tested and scientific method of an internet tier list. So let's take a look at the different swords. So using a tried and true method, we will have a tier list that's going to be composed of categories S, A, B, C, D, and then we'll skip all the way to F. So we'll break it up into sections of roughly 2 centimeters a piece of penetration. Anything above 10 centimeters of penetration will be considered S tier. Then 10 to 8 will be A, 8 to 6 will be B, 6 to 4 will be C, 4 to 2 will be D, and anything below 2 will be F tier. So how do all of the swords we've tested so far match up? We're only going to be looking at the normalized weights so far. So starting with the big Jian that we've tested, the Roaring Dragon by LK Chen makes it into a low A tier. The Striking Eagle, the two-handed Jian from the Han Dynasty, makes it into a high A tier. The Magnificent Chu Jian from the Warring State period is a mid A tier. The Soaring Sky Jian is a... Oh, I'm sorry. The Magnificent Chu Jian from the Warring States period is a mid B tier. The Soaring Sky from the early Han Dynasty is a low A tier. The White Ark from the Han Dynasty is the very, very top of the B tier. The Scarlet Sunrise from the Scarlet Sunrise Jian from the Jin Dynasty is the middle of the B tier. The Gale Wind from the Ming Dynasty comes in at the very bottom of the B tier. The Grand Marshal Jian, the very fancy style of Ming Jian, is at the top of the C tier. The White Serpent, and again, the example I had wasn't sharpened, so I reserve the right to come back and revisit this one, was also in the C tier. The Snow Peak Jian, which was from the Republic period, is in the middle of the B tier. The Flying Phoenix from the Han Dynasty, the four-sided or diamond cross-section Jian, was in the middle of the A tier, a powerful thruster. The Fiskar machete, with its very wide profile, is a D tier thrusting blade. The Cold Steel Gladius machete was a middle B tier. The LK Chen Royal Arsenal Handao, which looks a little bit like a machete, is a high B tier. So very different from the Fiskar machete, which was again a D tier. The two-handed Uchi-katana by Ronin Katana is a middle B tier. The Hanwei Viking sword is also a middle B tier. The Alvian Kluntarf Viking-style sword is a middle C tier. The Kingston Arms Type 14 arming sword is right on the border between B and A. I'll give it an A tier. The Spear Tip from LK Chen, the Silver Swallow Han-style spear, is a low A tier. A simple kitchen knife I have. A simple Henkel kitchen knife I used is a middle A tier. And finally, the VA Irish ring pommel sword that we just tested is a middle B tier. So there you have it. That's a different way of looking at penetration testing. Perhaps we'll use this going forward as a quick reference for those who get a little lost in the weeds by looking at all of the granular data and the individual raw numbers of each of the penetration testing. A quick comparison to just get an idea, is this a really, really good thrusting sword or perhaps not as good a thrusting sword? Now it's worth noting, remember, I'm comparing the big number, the normalized data of each of these swords. Comparing the naked drops, where they're just dropping under their own power, none of the swords compared rose above a C tier level of penetration, and many of them were in the D tier. Some of them, and some things like this Han spear, the spear tip is an A tier level of thruster when it is dropped under 2,500 grams. But because it's so light, when it's dropping under its own weight, it's an F tier. It falls under F tier. It has very little mass to be able to penetrate under the weight of its own, under the force of its own mass. So something to keep in mind. That's part of the reason why I add the normalization, in order to level the playing field if we just want to test how good a certain object's cross-section, stiffness, tip type is. For being able to thrust, I have to be able to come up with some way to eliminate as many variables as possible. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily translate into what we actually saw in the battlefield, because in the battlefield, all sorts of chaos is going on. People have weak arms. It's harder to lift something really heavy. Armor is taking place. Things are getting loose and falling and getting broken. You can't line up your shot correctly. So who knows what's actually going to happen when the chaos of actual combat takes place. And just because something on paper is shown to outperform something else in a controlled environment does not mean that's actually what occurred in the crucible of of the battlefield. So when choices were being made about the designs of weapons and what armories decided to stock, have to sit back and take a look at the bigger picture and find out what the needs were, what the soldiers were saying, what the commanders needed, and sometimes we can figure out why choices were being made. Sometimes it was just a fashion choice. Sometimes there were unforeseen reasons why decisions were made that we as historians are still digging out and figuring out the choices. Sometimes there are unforeseen factors that us historians are still putting those unknown parts back together and trying to put the pieces of the puzzle back together and put the complete the picture. So anyway, here's some food for thought. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be back next time for more penetration. Take care.